I didn't go down to the beast hold on purpose. That needs saying first, because by the time we docked at Vethara Station 6 weeks later, everyone on the Callowell's run had a version of the story, and most versions had me walking deliberately into the lower hold with some kind of plan. There was no plan. I was 22 years old. I had resin on my hands from a ventilation coupling I'd been patching for the better part of an hour, and I took a wrong turn in the maintenance corridor, because the emergency lighting on C-deck had been flickering for 3 days, and nobody had fixed it yet. That was me, by the way. I was the one who was supposed to fix it. The Callowell's run was not a pleasant ship to spend 11 days aboard if you were responsible for maintaining it. She was 23 years old, and she showed it in the way that working vessels show age, not in catastrophic failures, but in the accumulation of small disagreements between her systems, the kind that don't break anything individually but stack up in a way that keeps a maintenance aide moving from one end of the ship to the other all day. The atmospheric recyclers on B-deck ran 3 degrees warmer than their setting specified. The secondary water reclamation unit on A-deck made a harmonic sound at irregular intervals that wasn't on any fault register, but that you felt in the balls of your feet if you were standing near it in soft soles. The lighting on C-deck had been intermittent since departure, and the emergency strips that were supposed to compensate had a fault in 2 of their trigger sensors, so the corridor went from dim to dark at irregular intervals, which was not dangerous but was profoundly disorienting if you were carrying tools. I had been maintaining environmental systems on transport vessels for 3 years by then, starting with the short-haul resettlement runs in the inner cluster and working out to the longer crossings. I was not experienced in the way that the ship's actual crew were experienced. I did not know the vessel's history. I could not read her sounds the way her engineer could. I did not have the bone-deep familiarity that comes from years aboard the same hull. What I had was a basic certification, a methodical habit of mind, and a tolerance for the particular loneliness of being useful in a small, unglamorous way to a ship full of people who were frightened and exhausted, and trying not to show it. I didn't mind the work. I minded, sometimes, the weight of the ship, which was the weight of 411 people who had lost their cluster and were being carried toward a world they had never seen. And there was nothing I could do about that weight except fix the ventilation and keep the recyclers running and try to keep my face neutral when I was working in the passenger section, so nobody felt observed in their grief. I was, a civilian resettlement aide on a compact refugee transport. Callowell's run carried 411 displaced persons from the Verath cluster collapse, a skeleton crew of 26, a manifest of confiscated wildlife headed for the Vethara Rehabilitation Preserve, and one very junior civilian aide who had been assigned to the ship, because she had a basic certification in environmental systems maintenance, and the agency was short-staffed, and the ship needed someone to manage minor repairs, so the actual crew could focus on actual problems. My name is Petra Solis. I am not a soldier. I am not a cadet, though they started calling me that later and the title stuck in the way that titles do when nobody can think of anything more accurate. I have no combat record. I have no special training with animals, predatory or otherwise. I grew up in a mid-density resettlement block on Orvanis Secondary, which is not a place that produces people of particular distinction. I am ordinary. I know what I look like and what I am, and I have never had any reason to think otherwise. What happened on the Callowell's run did not change that. I want to be clear about that from the start, because people get confused about what the story means. It is not a story about a person being secretly special. It is a story about 3 cubs and one very old pack elder who had been on a ship for 11 days and had not yet found what they were looking for. And then they found it, and the finding of it turned out to be inconvenient for a number of people who had more authority than I did. The Sulhari are not from the Verath cluster. They were confiscated from a trafficking operation 2 systems over, 4 adults and a litter of 3, and the adults had not survived the seizure in good health. and by the time the Callowell's run took them aboard at Seth Point, only the pack held her. They called her the Marit in the beast management notes, a word from the Sulhari's native range that the handlers translated loosely as the grandmother who remembers, and the 3 cubs remained. The Marit was old. Her bioluminescent stripes had faded from the vivid copper gold they show in youth to a dim amber, and she moved slowly, and she slept most of the time. The cubs were 8 months old, which for a Sulhari means they were past the purely milk-dependent stage, but not yet independent, not yet grown into the full length of their 6 limbs, not yet carrying the weight that an adult Sulhari carries in its chest and shoulders. They were, in the technical language of the Wildlife Manifest, subadult females, and in the less technical language of everyone who looked at them through the hold's observation panel, they were the size of large dogs, and they were made of muscle and teeth, and they would not let anyone touch them. 3 handlers in 11 days. The first lost 2 fingers when she reached into the feeding slot without reading the behavioral notes properly. The second, a man who had worked with predatory animals for most of his adult life and who took it personally, went in suited and was knocked down and pinned, and came out with a cracked rib and a shaken certainty about his professional abilities. The third did everything right: read the notes, suited up, moved slowly, offered food on a long-handled tray, spoke in low tones, and was bitten through the suit on the forearm and had to be carried to medical. After the third handler, Compact Officer Marin Vash, who was the senior compact authority aboard the Callowell's run, and who treated the transport as if it were a patrol vessel under her personal command, made a decision. The Sulhari cubs would be sedated, placed in individual hardshell crates, and kept crated for the remainder of the journey. The Marit would remain in the main hold, but all human access would be suspended until docking. This was not, Vash explained in her directive, a welfare consideration. This was a liability and operational security decision, and it would be implemented within 24 hours. That directive was dated the morning of day 11. I went into the hold by accident on the evening of day 11. The ventilation coupling I was repairing was in the maintenance crawlspace that runs along the outer wall of C-deck, which is below the main passenger berths and above the cargo and animal holds. The coupling had been seeping warm air into the cargo level for 3 days, which was not dangerous, but was uncomfortable for the 411 people sleeping 1 deck up, and it had been on my list since day 8, and I had been putting it off because the access panel was in a section of corridor that required me to squeeze through a junction that smelled like recycled water and old metal, and something I could never quite identify. I am not particularly large. I fit. It just wasn't pleasant. I fixed the coupling. It took longer than it should have because one of the secondary fittings had been cross-threaded at some point in the ship's history, and I had to coax it rather than force it. And by the time I was back in the corridor, my hands were coated in the gray-green resin that the ship's atmospheric sealant uses, and my left knee was stiff from being bent in the same position for 40 minutes. I was tired, and I was paying more attention to my knee than to the corridor layout, and instead of turning right toward the maintenance ladder, I turned left, and the left passage in C-deck's aft junction does not go to the ladder. It goes to the secondary beast hold access. The door was not locked. This was later identified as a procedural failure. The door should have been locked after the third handler incident. It was not. I pushed it open because I thought I was pushing open the maintenance stairwell door, and I stepped through, and the air hit me. I have tried to describe the smell of a Sulhari hold to people who haven't encountered one, and I have never done it well. It is warm and it is sharp, and it is something under both of those things that I do not have a good word for. Not unpleasant, not threatening exactly. It is the smell of something very alive in a contained space, and it arrives in your chest before it arrives in your nose, if that makes any sense. I felt it before I processed it. I stopped. I stopped because I realized I was not in the maintenance stairwell, And because the room I had walked into was dim and large, and the smell was significant, and because there was movement in the far left corner that I registered with the part of my brain that is older than language. I turned my head slowly, the way you turn your head when you have already understood that moving quickly would be a mistake, even though you don't yet know what you're looking at. 3 sets of copper eyes. They were in the left corner, in a loose grouping, not pressed together the way frightened animals press together, but arranged. That is the word I keep coming back to. Arranged. As if they had been placed there by something deliberate. The bioluminescent stripes were dim in the hold's low light, a faint blue-white along the shoulder ridges and the outer lines of their 6 limbs, and their faces were what I would call composed, if I were allowed to use that word about an animal. Not aggressive, not curious in the bouncy, ears-forward way of young creatures that haven't learned better, watchful, evaluating. I had walked in without a suit. I had walked in without a tray. I had walked in with resin on my hands and a sore knee, and my mind half on the ventilation coupling and half on whether I had logged the repair correctly. And I was standing 6 meters from 3 subadult Sulhari who had put 3 trained handlers in medical in the past week and a half. I didn't run. I want to be honest about why I didn't run. It was not bravery. It was that I looked at them and something in me went very quiet, and in the quiet I understood, not thought, not reasoned, but understood the way you understand temperature, that running was not the right thing to do. So I didn't. I stood still. I stood still with my hands slightly out from my sides, the way you stand when you want to show someone that your hands are empty, and I breathed, and I looked at them without trying to hold their gaze and without looking away. There is a middle distance that is neither submission nor challenge. I don't know how I knew where it was. I just found it. The smallest of the 3, distinguishable by the nick in her left ear that the handler's notes described, though I did not know that yet, shifted her weight forward. She did not pounce. She leaned. She put the weight of her front 2 limbs forward, and she extended her neck slightly, and she breathed in, long and deliberate, and I stood there with resin on my hands and let her. She breathed me in for a long time. The other 2 watched. Then she sat down. I don't know how long I stood there after that. Long enough for my knee to stop aching, which suggests it was at least 20 minutes. I didn't move toward them. I didn't speak. I just stayed still, and the smallest one stayed sitting and eventually folded her front limbs under her in the way a resting cat folds its forelegs, and the other 2 drifted slowly, without urgency, to positions slightly closer than they had been. And nobody was bitten, and nothing was cracked. And at some point I became aware that the lights in the hold had cycled to the ship's equivalent of late evening, and I was going to be missed if I didn't return to the aide berthing. I left slowly. I did not turn my back until I was past the door threshold. None of them moved when I went. I lay in my bunk that night and looked at the berth above me and thought about what had happened, which was that nothing had happened, technically, and I was not sure what to do with it. I considered reporting it. The unlocked door should be reported regardless. I filed the maintenance report for the unlocked door before I went to sleep and did not mention that I had gone inside. I went back the next evening. I am not sure I can fully explain why, except that I thought about them the entire next day. I thought about the smallest one leaning forward to breathe me in. I thought about the arranged quality of their grouping, and the way the other 2 had drifted closer without being called. I thought about how tired I was of being on a ship full of frightened people, and bureaucratic directives, and compact officer Vosh's daily briefings about operational standards, and how the 20 minutes in the hold had been the quietest 20 minutes of the entire voyage. I went back. I brought nothing. I wore my work clothes. I went in and stood near the door and let them find me, and the smallest one, her name in the intake notes was Cub Unit 3, which told me everything I needed to know about the intake process, came to the middle distance within about 5 minutes, and this time her sister, the one with the broader shoulders and the slightly uneven gait on her rear left limb, came with her. The third hung back. She was the largest, the most cautious, and I later came to understand that this was her nature and not a sign of disapproval. She was watching. She watches everything. I sat down on the hold floor. This was a decision I made with my body rather than my mind. My knee was sore again and the floor was there, and it felt right to be at a lower angle. The smallest one, I started thinking of her as Niv, which is not from any language I know, just the sound that fitted her, took 3 steps toward me and stopped. I looked at my hands. She looked at my hands. I turned them over, palms up, the resin from the previous day already scrubbed off, though my palms were still faintly stained gray-green. She put her nose on my left palm and breathed. Then she sat down again, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her, and I stayed very still. And after a while I became aware that the larger one, I would come to call her Veth, because on day 4 she pressed her whole face against my shoulder and left a smear of bioluminescent residue in an elongated mark that looked like the glyph for the letter in the Varath script, had settled behind me to the left, and that I was, in some technical sense, surrounded by 2 of the 3 Sulhari cubs, and that the third was watching from 8 meters away with the steady, careful attention she gave everything. I sat there until my knee truly ached. I left quietly. The Marit had not moved from her corner across the hold, but when I reached the door I glanced back and her copper eyes were open and on me, and she was still, and I could not read anything in that stillness except that it did not feel hostile. On day 14, Veth followed me to the door. On days 15 and 16, before Vosh found me in the mess, I brought a small piece of the dried protein ration that the ship's manifest listed as a supplemental food source for the Sulhari. The handlers had been leaving these in the feeding slots, and the cubs had been taking them, grudgingly, in the handlers' notes, meaning they ate when the handlers were out of the hold and left the food untouched while anyone was present. I wanted to see what they would do if I offered directly. What Niv did was approach the food in my hand from a distance of about 20 centimeters, smell it for a long time, and then take it from my palm with the delicate precision of a creature that could have taken my fingers with it and had decided not to. She held it in her mouth for a moment without chewing, the way you hold something when you are deciding whether it is trustworthy, and then she ate it, and then she sat back down against my leg, and the pulse of her stripes was bright and quick. Veth refused the ration from my hand, but took it from the floor when I set it down, which I thought was her way of maintaining a position she found dignified. I respected this. Seth did not approach the food at all, but she moved for the first time to a position approximately 6 meters away rather than staying in the upper shelf corner, and she watched with the focused attention that was, I was learning, her standard mode of engagement with the world. She was not indifferent. She was taking extensive notes. On day 14, Veth followed me to the door. This was a problem. Not because Veth intended harm. She had not attempted harm since the second time I visited, none of them had. The problem was that the door to the secondary hold access had been relocked after I filed the maintenance report, but I had been given an access code because I was responsible for the SeaDeck ventilation systems, and I had been going in and out for 3 days. And on day 14, when I stepped through the door to leave, Veth's shoulder was already at the threshold. I turned back. I said quietly, the first time I had spoken aloud in the hold, not yet. Veth stopped. I have told this part of the story many times, and I always get the same pause from the people I'm telling it to. Not a dramatic pause, not a held-breath pause, the pause of someone recalibrating, because I did not use a command trained into her. She had no trained commands. I just used 2 words in my normal voice, and she stopped with her shoulder at the threshold and looked at me, and I looked at her, and after a moment she stepped back. She stepped back and she sat down 3 meters from the door and she waited. I left. I relocked the door. I stood in the corridor for a moment with my hand on the panel and I thought, this is going to become a situation. It became a situation on day 16. I don't know who reported it. The most likely candidate is one of the cargo monitors, because the Callowell's run had a passive surveillance system in the hold corridors, and the footage would have shown me entering and exiting the secondary access every evening for 5 days. I was not trying to hide it exactly. I had filed the unlocked door report on day 11, and I knew the access logs showed my code, but I had not formally disclosed that I was sitting in the hold with the Sulhari. Partly because I didn't think what I was doing constituted a reportable activity, and partly because I knew that Vosh would have an opinion about it, and I had been on the ship for 16 days, and I already had a reasonable sense of what Vosh's opinions felt like to be on the receiving end of. She found me in the mess at 0700 on day 16. She sat down across from me with a data tablet and a cup of something that smelled like the ship's institutional coffee, and looked at me for a moment before she spoke. Vosh was about 50. Not large, but the kind of person whose physical presence takes up more room than their body occupies, which is a quality I associate with people who have spent a long time being certain that the space around them belongs to them. Her hair was cut very short, and her uniform was very pressed, and she had the kind of eyes that do the work of the conversation before the words start. "You've been accessing the secondary beast hold," she said. "Yes. Your access code is for C-Deck environmental systems. The secondary access is on C-Deck." She looked at me. "You went in without a suit." "Yes. 3 trained handlers have been injured." "I know. You're an environmental systems aide." "Yes." She was not raising her voice. I want to be clear about that, because in my memory of this conversation I sometimes insert a harshness that wasn't there, and that would be inaccurate. She was not harsh. She was precise, and precision in a certain register is its own kind of pressure. "The Sulhari are scheduled for sedation and individual crating," she said. "Today. The directive was issued on day 11. "I know about the directive." "Then you understand that your access is no longer appropriate." I drank my coffee. I thought about what to say. What I said was, "The directive hasn't been implemented yet." "That's a scheduling issue." "I understand. I'm rescheduling it for today." I nodded. I finished my coffee. I went back to my maintenance duties, and I spent the morning fixing a humidity exchanger in the passenger berthing section, and I did not go back to the hold during the day shift. I thought about the sedation schedule. I thought about Niv folding her front limbs under her and the warmth of her sitting close. I thought about Veth stepping back from the threshold when I said 2 words. I went to the hold that evening anyway. Niv was at the door before I had it fully open. Not in a threatening way. She was simply there at the threshold, in the way a dog meets you at a door, present, oriented, the whole body oriented. The bioluminescent stripes along her shoulder ridges were bright, brighter than I had seen them, a vivid blue-white that pulsed once slowly when she saw me. I stepped in and she turned with me and walked, her shoulder at my knee, down to the center of the hold where we usually settled. Veth was already awake and watching from her habitual position to the left. The third, I was calling her Seth by then, after the station where they'd been taken aboard, because she was the watchful one, and it seemed right to give her a name with that quality of distance in it, was in the upper right corner, which was new. She had not used the upper shelf of the hold before. She looked down at me from there for a long time before she descended. I sat. Niv settled against my left side. The weight of her was significant, about 45 kilograms when I eventually had to carry her, which happened later, though not on this night. She rested her head across my thigh, and her stripes pulsed gently, the slow rhythm of a creature at rest. Veth arranged herself behind me, which was her habit, and the warmth of her at my back was such that after about 10 minutes I stopped noticing where I ended and she began. Seth came down from the shelf slowly. She crossed the hold floor and stopped 2 meters away and looked at me with the focused attention she brought to everything, and then she lay down facing me, her head on her folded front limbs, the luminescent lines of her stripe spots making a faint geometric pattern on the floor in front of her. She had never been this close. I did not move. Across the hold, in the corner where she always stayed, the Marrot was awake. I became aware of her the way you become aware of a sound you hadn't noticed until it changed. Not that she moved, but that her attention shifted, or rather that I became aware that her attention had been on me for some time. Her stripes were the faded amber of age, and they did not pulse the way the cubs did, but they were lit steadily, and her copper eyes in the dim hold were very still and very present and not at all asleep. I looked at her. I did not approach. She did not approach. We looked at each other across the hold with 3 cubs between us, and I felt, this is the part that is hardest to articulate, that I was being assessed by something that had assessed many things and reached many verdicts, and that the verdict was still being formed, and that patience was the only appropriate response. I went back to my bunk that night, and I lay awake for a while, and I thought, Vash is going to implement the sedation directive tomorrow. I was wrong about the timing. She moved faster. I learned about it at 0600 on day 17 from the ship's internal notification system, which sent me an access revocation notice. My code for the secondary hold access had been deactivated. This was followed, at 0615, by a message from Vash's administrative aide, a young man named Set who had the apologetic manner of someone who had been assigned to deliver messages he disagreed with for long enough that it had worn grooves in him, informing me that my duties had been reassigned and that I was no longer responsible for SeaDeck environmental systems. I was reassigned to passenger section humanitarian coordination, which was a real job and a needed one, and had nothing to do with any deck that contained Sulhari. I understood what she was doing. I want to give Vash credit for the logic of it, because the logic was sound. I was an unauthorized variable in a situation that had already produced 3 medical incidents. Removing the unauthorized variable was the procedurally correct action. She was right, by the standards that governed her. I ate breakfast. I filed my reassignment acknowledgement. I went to the passenger section and began coordinating humanitarian intake forms for the Vethara docking procedure. At 0930, Set found me in the passenger section with the look that had become familiar. "There's a situation in the beast hold," he said. The situation was that Vash had sent 2 handlers, new ones. The ship had 4 total and 2 remained uninjured, into the primary hold with sedation equipment, intending to move the cubs to individual crates. The Marrot, who had not approached any human handler in 11 days aboard the ship, had positioned herself between the handlers and the cubs and had not moved. I say positioned. What Set said was that she had come off the floor for the first time since boarding and put herself in the center of the hold, and made a sound that was outside the range the handler's monitoring equipment was designed to capture, which meant it was either above or below the standard audible range and possibly both, and both handlers had experienced it as a physical sensation in their chests, and had retreated to the observation corridor without quite meaning to. "Director Vash is requesting your presence in an advisory capacity," Set said. I noticed that he said advisory. Vash was in the observation corridor with the 2 handlers when I arrived. She looked at me the way people look at a piece of equipment they have already decided not to use when the equipment turns out to be the only option. There was something under that look that I did not name at the time, but that I later understood was the specific frustration of a person who has very good reasons for the position she holds, and is watching those reasons come apart in a small room. "The Marrot will not allow the handlers access to the cubs," she said. "No. I need to implement the sedation directive." "I understand. Can you go in and—" She stopped, started again. "Do you have any ability to calm them?" It was not quite a question. It was the sentence of someone who had already decided on the answer, and was checking to see if the other person knew it too. "I don't know," I said, which was honest. What I knew was that I had been sitting with 3 cubs for 6 evenings, and nobody had been injured, and the Marret had kept her place in the corner. And I didn't know what had changed this morning, except that 2 people had come into the primary hold with sedation equipment, and the Marret had reached a conclusion. Vosh gave me the primary access code. She did not reinstate my CDEC code, which was a subtle distinction that I noticed and did not comment on. I went in through the primary hold entrance. The hold was larger than the secondary and brighter, and the Marret was in the center of it, standing, which was the first time I had seen her standing in 17 days. She was larger than she looked when she was lying down. Adult Sulhari reach a shoulder height of about 1.2 meters and a body length, excluding the tail, of approximately 2 meters, and the Marret was not a small adult. Her amber stripes were lit, not brightly, but lit, and her 6 limbs were planted, and her head was low and forward in the posture that the behavioral notes described as pre-aggression. Behind her, in the right-hand corner of the hold, were the 3 cubs. Niv saw me and her stripes flashed bright. I walked in slowly and I stood in the center of the hold, not close to the Marret, not advancing toward the cubs, just present in the space, and I said nothing for a while. I looked at the Marret and she looked at me. Her stripes did not change. Her posture did not change. I sat down on the floor. There is no tactical logic to sitting down in front of a large predator that has placed itself in a pre-aggression posture. I know this. I sat down because standing felt wrong, and the floor was where I usually was in this hold. And I thought, this is not strategy. This is not training. This is just something I thought, that the Marret had been watching me for 17 days from across a room, and that the verdict had been forming all that time, and that the next thing I did was going to matter more than anything I could say. I sat down, and I turned my hands palm up on my thighs, and I was still. The Marret looked at me for a long time. Then she walked toward me slowly, with the measured stride of a very old creature that has survived long enough to understand what patience costs and what it returns. She stopped 2 meters from me. She lowered her head until her nose was at the level of my face, and she breathed me in, long and deliberate, the same way Niv had breathed me in on the second evening. The amber stripes along her neck pulsed once. She sat down. From the corner, 3 sets of copper eyes watched. Then Niv broke from the group and crossed the hold at a trot and put her head in my lap, and Veth followed, and even Seth came slowly and arranged herself a meter to my left. The Marret remained where she was, 2 meters away, seated, her amber stripes lit and steady. I heard, from the observation corridor, the sound of someone releasing a very controlled breath. After that, things changed on the Callowell's run. Not immediately and not simply. Vosh did not rescind the sedation directive that day. She suspended it, which is a different thing, and she wrote a note in the operational log that described the situation in language that was precise and measured, and that I thought at the time was probably designed to distribute responsibility across multiple parties in case anything went wrong. This is a survival skill in bureaucratic environments, and I don't hold it against her. She was working with information she had, and the information she had did not include a framework for what was happening. The handlers did not have a framework either. They started calling my daily visits the Solis Protocol, which I found both flattering and embarrassing, and the ship's chief biological systems officer, a woman named Tarvin who had been documenting the Sulhari behavior since departure, began requesting that I let her observe, which I agreed to. Tarvin was quiet and methodical and took notes without disrupting the hold's atmosphere, and she was the one who eventually coined the term sovereign still, not as an official designation, but as a shorthand she used in her notes for the specific quality of Petra Solis' presence that she could document and could not explain. Tarvin showed me the note on day 23. She had written, "The behavioral shift in the Sulhari litter appears contingent on the presence of aide Solis, specifically on what can be described as a quality of stillness that is distinct from ordinary human physical motionlessness. The aide is not motionless. She moves naturally, adjusts her position, sometimes speaks. The quality is better described as an absence of the particular kind of attention that predators register as threat assessment. Most humans in proximity to the Sulhari, including trained handlers, continue to perform low-level threat assessment even when attempting calm. Their eyes move in patterns the Sulhari register. Their breathing is controlled in ways the Sulhari register. Their muscle tone carries the signature of a species preparing for a contingency. Aide Solis does not appear to do this. In her presence, the Sulhari's threat monitoring appears to decrease substantially, and the cubs engage in the affiliative behaviors, grooming requests, proximity maintenance, shared resting, that indicate social bonding rather than tolerance. Designating, sovereign still, cause unknown, effect measurable. I read this. I gave the tablet back to Tarvin. I said, "I don't do anything special." Tarvin looked at me with the expression of a scientist who has been told that the result of her experiment was nothing. "I know," she said. "That's essentially what I wrote." The cubs were in my bunk compartment by day 25. This is not as dramatic as it sounds, and it is slightly more logistically complicated than it sounds. The Callowell's Run was not a military vessel, and it did not have military-grade secure berthing, and the bunk compartments in the aide and crew section were separated from the SeaDeck corridor by a standard pressure-sealed door. And on day 24, Niv learned that this door could be pushed open from the inside if the latch was not fully secured. The latch on the secondary hold access door on SeaDeck had been replaced after the Day 11 report. The latch on the door from the SeaDeck corridor to the aide section had not been recently inspected, and it was not fully reliable, and on the morning of day 24 I woke up because something very warm and very heavy had settled across my legs. Veth had not only pushed the door open but had navigated the crew corridor and found my compartment, which was identifiable, presumably, by the same quality of sovereign still that Tarvin was documenting, and made a decision about where she wanted to sleep. Niv arrived 11 minutes later. Seth waited in the corridor doorway for approximately an hour before she came in and lay down on the floor. I lay there with Veth across my legs and Niv pressed against my left side and Seth breathing quietly in the corner, and I thought, Vosh is going to have a considerable opinion about this. She did. It took 3 days for the information to reach her, because Seth, who was the first non-me person to discover the new sleeping arrangement, decided that it was not an emergency and did not require immediate escalation. This was a professional judgment call that he made, I think, partly because he was tired of delivering bad news to Vosh and partly because he had been watching my evenings in the hold through the monitoring system along with everyone else on the ship, and had reached his own conclusions about which variables were and were not the problem. When Vosh did find out, she summoned me to her office, which was a small room near the bridge that smelled of institutional coffee and contained 1 desk and 2 chairs and a wall of operational directives in print format because Vosh did not trust anything that was only stored digitally. She did not this time sit down. "The Sulhari cubs are in your berthing section," she said. "Yes. This represents a significant safety and liability exposure for this vessel. I understand your concern. I'm going to need you to—" She stopped. From the corridor outside her office door came a sound. Not aggressive, not loud. A low, frequency-carrying sound felt as much as heard, the kind of sound that the Sulhari make when they are tracking. Tarvin had described it in her notes as a contact call, a sound the cubs made when they were following Petra through the ship and could not immediately see her, to maintain orientation. The sound paused, then it repeated slightly closer. Vosh looked at her closed door. She looked at me. "There in the corridor," I said. which was unnecessary information but felt like the kind of thing that needed to be said aloud. Your birthing section is 3 decks down. They navigate well. Vash turned back to look at me and I saw, for the first time, something shift in her expression that was not precision and was not frustration. It was something older than those things. The look of a person who has been very certain for a very long time, and is finding the certainty has left a gap she doesn't know how to fill. She sat down. "Aide Solis," she said, "I am the senior compact authority on this vessel. My directives have operational force. You understand that?" "Yes." "I issued a directive regarding the sedation and crating of the Sulhari on day 11. "Yes." "I suspended that directive on day 17. "Yes." "I need you to tell me, honestly, what you think is happening here." I sat for a moment. The contact call came again from outside the door, closer, and then stopped. Through the door I could hear the small sounds of something large settling on the corridor floor. "I think the Sulhari were in a very bad situation," I said. 4 of them came aboard. 1 survived who was old enough to make decisions, and she had 3 cubs who didn't have anyone, and she'd been watching the handlers for 11 days and found them wanting, and then I walked in. And I think she was tired, and I think what she found was something that didn't require her to stay vigilant, and she was very old and she needed somewhere to put down the weight of it. Vash was quiet for a moment. "And the cubs," she said. "The cubs were following her verdict. But you're the one they follow now." "The merit still makes the decisions," I said. I think I'm what she decided on." Vash looked at her desk. She looked at the wall of printed directives. She said quietly, and I thought at the time that she was possibly not directing this at me specifically, "This is outside my operational framework." "Yes," I said. "The directive is still in suspension." "Yes." She looked at me with the precise, measuring eyes. "You'll take full behavioral responsibility for the animals in your care." It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. That was day 27. For the remaining 31 days of the voyage, the Sulhari cubs had unrestricted access to my berthing section and to any other area of the ship they chose to access, which turned out to be more areas than anyone on the crew had anticipated. Niv developed a strong interest in the passenger section's common area, specifically in a corner near the water reclamation unit that she apparently found thermally interesting. Veth spent significant portions of 3 separate afternoons in the cargo logistics office, sitting on the duty officer's chair, while the duty officer stood in the corner, and did his work from a portable terminal with the careful, well-behaved energy of someone who has decided not to make anything worse. Seth never went farther than the C-deck corridor junction, but she went there every evening and sat and watched the traffic, and the crew learned to walk past her with the particular kind of relaxed composure that is different from forced composure, because forced composure has its own signature and Seth, at least, could read it. The Marit never left the primary hold, but she was awake more. I visited her every day. I sat in the primary hold for an hour each morning early before my duties started, and the Marit was always awake when I arrived. We had a way of being together that I can only describe as mutual acknowledgement. She knew I was there. I knew she was there. Neither of us required anything of the other except the continued presence. She never touched me the way the cubs touched me, and I never reached for her. But on day 38 she moved from her corner to the center of the hold, and I moved from my usual spot near the door to approximately 2 meters from her, and we sat like that for the remainder of the hour. On day 42 she moved to 1 meter. Her amber stripes pulsed on a slow rhythm, the long, even pulse that Tarvin had documented as the resting comfortable state, the one the cubs showed when they were sleeping against me. I sat with my hands in my lap and my knee was no longer bothering me, and the primary hold was quiet except for the ship's structural hum and the sound of the Marit breathing, which was low and regular and very present, and I thought that this was what it felt like to be trusted by something that had reason not to trust. On day 45, she put her nose against the back of my hand. Just briefly, a single moment of contact, no longer than a breath, and then she withdrew. Her stripes were very bright when she did it, brighter than I had seen them since the day I first went into the hold on day 17 when she rose to defend the cubs, and then they subsided to the slow amber pulse, and she settled, and we stayed in our 2-meter distance for the rest of the hour, and neither of us needed to make more of it than it was. Tarvin wrote in her notes, Merit behavior reclassified, initial assessment, guarding the cubs against perceived threat of transport, current assessment, selected a human and is maintaining proximity relationship, designation unchanged, sovereign still. The aide is the variable. There is one more thing that happened before we docked, and it happened on day 51, and it is the part of the story that got told the most in the versions that didn't come from me. Vash had an administrative aide, Set, who I've mentioned. Set was competent and apologetic and fundamentally decent, and he had, over the course of the voyage, accumulated a reasonable amount of goodwill from the crew by being the person who communicated difficult directives in the most humane way possible. He was not responsible for what happened on day 51. Vash had a second administrative function she used infrequently, a direct action aide, for situations that required physical implementation of directives rather than communication. His name was Dorvin. I had encountered him twice in the previous 50 days and formed an impression of him as a person who derived a particular satisfaction from being the physical expression of administrative authority. He was larger than Set by approximately 30 centimeters in every dimension, and he carried himself with the certainty of someone who had never found his physical presence to be insufficient for any task he'd applied it to. On day 51, Vash received new instructions from Compact Administrative Oversight, relayed through the ship's communications system, regarding the Vethara docking procedures. These instructions included an updated welfare directive from the Rehabilitation Preserves Intake Coordinator, which specified that the Sulhari should be transported to the preserve in individual transfer units rather than freely, for the preserve's own intake protocols, not for safety reasons. This was a legitimate directive from a legitimate authority. Vash sent Dorvin to my berthing section with a transfer unit carrier. I was not in my berthing section. I was in the passenger section, helping with Vethara docking paperwork, which is how the sequence of events had the shape it had. Dorvin opened my berthing compartment door. Niv and Veth were inside. What happened next was documented by the corridor surveillance system and reviewed by Tarvin and eventually included in her behavioral report to the Rehabilitation Preserve. I was told about it afterward, first by Set, then by Tarvin, then by the corridor surveillance footage itself, which I watched twice and which I still think about sometimes. Dorvin entered the compartment with a transfer unit carrier. He was suited because he had been told about the handler injuries. He approached Niv, who was awake on my bunk, with a transfer collar extended. From the open door of the primary beast hold at the end of the C-deck corridor, a door that had been left, as it turned out, on an unlatched setting that I had been using for easy access, came a sound. Not the contact call. Not the low tracking frequency. Something older than those things. A sound from below the usual range of communication, the sound Tarvin had described in her early notes as the physical sensation in the chest sound, the one that had cleared the hold on day 17 when the Merit blocked the handlers. Dorvin stopped. In the surveillance footage, you can see his posture change. Not a flinch. Something more fundamental, the whole body revising its assessment of the room it was standing in. The Merit came down the corridor. She was not running. She walked at the measured pace she used in the primary hold, with the low and forward head position, her amber stripes fully lit for the first time in the voyage, not pulsing but steady and bright. She came to the open door of my compartment, and she stopped, and she looked at Dorvin. Niv had not moved from my bunk. She was watching. Veth, who had been in the corridor when Dorvin arrived, was behind the Marit. Dorvin took one step backward. The Marit walked into the compartment and placed herself between Dorvin and the bunk where Niv was sitting. She was not touching him. She was not making the chest sound anymore. She was simply there, between him and the cub, with the steady amber light of her stripes and the low and forward head and the planted 6 limbs, and she was completely still, and the stillness was the clearest communication I have ever heard about from a creature I was not present for. Dorvin left the compartment. He left the compartment and he went back to the administrative section, and he told Vosh what had happened, and the transfer unit carrier was logged as a failed implementation attempt, and Vosh sent Set to find me. I arrived in the C-deck corridor to find the Marit in my compartment doorway, sitting, and the 3 cubs arranged behind her, and Tarvin standing in the corridor with a recording device and the expression of a scientist whose hypothesis has been confirmed by evidence she did not expect. "The Marit self-mobilized," Tarvin said. "That's the first time she's moved outside the hold perimeter in 17 days on this vessel." "Is Dorvin all right?" "He is fine. He was not touched." I looked at the Marit in the doorway. She looked back at me. Her stripes pulsed once, slowly, amber and steady. I said, "Easy." The Marit sat back on her haunches. Not away from the door. She did not give the door to me, or to any other hypothetical Dorvin. She stayed in the threshold, and she was comfortable there, and she had decided that the threshold was where she would be. I decided not to argue with this. Vosh voided the transfer unit directive herself. I found out later that she sent a direct communication to the Rehabilitation Preserve's intake coordinator, explaining that the Sulhari currently aboard the Callowell's Run had formed a significant social attachment to a crew member, and that the preservation of this attachment structure through the docking and intake process was likely to be the most efficient means of achieving a calm and low-risk transfer. She used careful language. She cited Tarvin's behavioral documentation. She did not describe what had happened in the corridor in terms that a reader unfamiliar with the voyage would find extraordinary, which was, I thought, the correct approach. The intake coordinator asked who the crew member was. Vosh told her. The intake coordinator said, and this is in the official communication record, an environmental systems aide. Vosh replied, yes. There was a pause in the communication exchange of approximately 12 minutes, which represents a significant delay for a standard operational message, and then the intake coordinator wrote back, "We'll prepare an extended habitation bay." We docked at Vethara Station on day 58, at 0800, in a bay that smelled of sea salt minerals and growing things, and the particular green warmth of a world that is doing its best to welcome something it has never had before. The docking bay was wide, and the ramp was long, and the preserve's intake team was waiting at the bottom of it with the careful readiness of people who had been told something extraordinary was coming, and were not sure they believed it. I walked down the ramp. Niv was at my left knee. Veth was at my right, her shoulder warm against my thigh. Seth was a step behind because she is always a step behind, watching, which is her nature. The Marit came last, at a pace that matched mine, neither pressed close nor held back, simply there. We walked down the ramp, and the intake team stood very still, the way you stand still when the moment requires it, and you have the good sense to understand that. At the bottom of the ramp, on the smooth prefabricated floor of the station docking bay, I stopped. Niv and Veth stopped. Seth stopped. The Marit stopped. I turned and I looked at the 3 of them, the cubs I had sat with for 44 evenings in a dim hold, who had decided I was the safest thing on the ship and had not yet unlearned this decision. Niv's stripes were bright and fast, the way they are when she is happy, which I had learned was a different rhythm from the way they look when she is curious or alert. Veth was pressed close, her whole shoulder leaning into my leg, and Seth was watching me with the specific attention she brings to anything she has decided to make a long-term study of. I said, "Okay." Then I said, "Stay." Then I walked away from them slowly toward the intake team, and I didn't look back. The three cubs sat down at the bottom of the ramp. They sat there in a row, the way the Merit had sat in my compartment doorway, not retreating, not unhappy, just present and still, waiting with the absolute confidence of creatures that had been waiting a long time for the right person and had found her and were not yet ready to stop knowing where she was. The preserve director was a woman of about 60 who had been working with displaced predator animals for 30 years. She looked at the three cubs sitting at the bottom of the ramp, and she looked at me and she said, very quietly, "How did you do that?" I said, "I didn't do anything." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I believe you, that's what makes it remarkable." I was reassigned to Vethara Rehabilitation Preserve on a 6-month secondment, which became a year, which has been extended twice. My official title is Resettlement Aide Environmental Integration, which is a title that does not tell you anything useful about what I actually do, which is that I am present. The Merit is in the Northern Recovery Habitation. She sleeps most of the time now and her stripes are dim and she does not need me to visit, but I visit. I sit with her in the early morning, in the space between her decision and whatever comes next for her, and I am still, and she is still, and the light through the habitat panels is very clear and she is very old and very tired, and the weight she has been carrying is, I think, a little lighter. The cubs are in the extended habitation bay, which adjoins the Northern Recovery through a mesh corridor. And every evening when I leave the Merit's habitat and walk back through the corridor, the three of them are at the mesh. Niv's stripes go bright every time. She has never stopped doing this. I tell her easy, and she sits, and we look at each other through the mesh for a moment. And then I keep walking and she stays. And the stillness between us is the particular stillness of two creatures that have already found what they were looking for and do not need to keep looking. That is, as best I can tell, what the preserve director meant when she said remarkable. Not that I am extraordinary. Not that I did something no one else could do. Just that I walked into a room with my hands covered in engine resin and a sore knee, and an absence of the particular anxiety that most species carry like a second skin. And a very old creature looked at me across a dim hold and formed a verdict, and the verdict was, "Here." That is the whole story. I don't know what to do with it most days. I just keep showing up.